we're learning a major arrest was just made.
He was ambushed by a group of men who assaulted him.
You'd think they could simply have killed him.
I'm not sure exactly what actually happened.
Jorge, is El Mayo speaking out?
You've probably heard about the arrest of Ismael El Mayo Zambada by now, the man who managed to stay one step ahead of the law for over half a century, the last of the old-school narco bosses, finally in custody. It's huge news, no doubt about it, but here's the thing. This story isn't as straightforward as it seems. Everyone's been wondering how a man who managed to evade justice for so long got caught so easily, and rightly so, given the fact. Well, it turns out there might have been some serious betrayal going on. We're talking about allegations of ambush, kidnapping, and a plot so twisted that it's hard to tell who is even telling the truth. As we unravel this mystery, we'll explore claims that have everyone from drug lords to government officials pointing fingers.
How did the son of an imprisoned drug lord end up on a private plane in El Paso, Texas?
Was El Mayo really outsmarted, or was he the victim of an elaborate setup? And who's really pulling the strings in this high-stakes game of cat and mouse? It all started on a sunny day in July 2024. El Mayo, the man who's managed to stay off the radar for longer than some of us have even been alive, is just going about his business. Maybe he's sipping on a cold cerveza, thinking about his next move in the never-ending chess game of the drug trade. Little does he know, he's about to become the unwitting star of one of the most audacious sting operations in history. Now, before we dive into what went down that day, let's take a moment to appreciate just who we're dealing with here. Ismael El Mayo Zambada isn't your run-of-the-mill drug lord. This guy's a living legend in the narco world. At 76 years old, he'd managed to stay at the top of the game for 5 whole decades without ever seeing the inside of a jail cell. Can you imagine that? While other cartel bosses were getting caught, escaping, and generally living life like narco rock stars, El Mayo was the quiet power behind the throne.
The Sinaloa cartel is basically run by a person that nobody hears about, who's very discreet, and that's El Mayo Zambada.
This pretty much sums up El Mayo's whole strategy. While guys like El Chapo were making headlines with dramatic prison escapes, El Mayo was the puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But here's where it gets interesting. On that fateful day in July, El Mayo's legendary caution seems to have failed him. If you were to believe the official story, he boarded a private plane, thinking he was off to inspect some new territory. Instead, he ended up in handcuffs on American soil. Talk about a bad day at the office, right?
This private airplane left the city of Hermosillo, Mexico around 8 o'clock this morning and landed, yesterday morning, Thursday, and landed in El Paso a couple hours later. Both of these suspects were processed. We've seen photos of them.
Now, I don't know about you, but something about this story just doesn't add up. How does a man who's been outsmarting authorities for half a century suddenly fall for such a simple trick? It's like finding out that Houdini passed while trying to escape from a pair of handcuffs. It just doesn't make sense. And that's where things start to get really juicy. You see, El Mayo isn't taking this lying down. Through his lawyer, he's making some pretty wild accusations. He's saying he didn't just get tricked, he's now saying that he got straight up kidnapped. According to El Mayo's version of events, he was ambushed after being led to believe he was attending a meeting with the governor of Sinaloa, Ruben Rocha Moya. Now, imagine that for a second. You're expecting to sit down with a high-ranking government official, and the next thing you know, you're being thrown onto a plane bound for the US. El Mayo must have been shocked, to say the least. But why don't we take a look at that El Mayo had to say about his whole ordeal? He certainly didn't mince words in his statement from prison, that's for sure. To the contrary, I was kidnapped and brought to the US forcibly and against my will. Now, that's a pretty serious accusation. We're not just talking about a clever sting operation anymore. If what El Mayo's saying is true, we're looking at a potential international incident. But wait, it gets even crazier. El Mayo claims that when he arrived at the supposed meeting spot, he was confronted by men in military uniforms. These guys allegedly threw him to the ground, put a hood over his head, and bundled him onto the plane. It's like something out of a spy thriller, isn't it? Now, you might be thinking, come on, this sounds too wild to be true. And you'd be right to be skeptical. After all, El Mayo's not exactly known for his honesty. But here's the thing. Some pretty credible sources are backing up his story, at least partially. Take the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Ken Salazar. He's gone on record saying, "The evidence we saw suggests he was brought to the U.S. against his will." So when a high-ranking diplomat is lending credence to a drug lord's kidnapping claims, you know something fishy is going on. But the plot thickens even further. Remember how we talked about betrayal earlier? Well, this is where things get really twisted. Who is the mastermind behind this whole operation? Allegedly, it was none other than Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the son of El Mayo's former partner, the infamous El Chapo. Yeah, you heard that right. We're talking about the son of El Mayo's old buddy potentially setting him up. It's like a real-life version of The Godfather, only with more drugs and fewer cannolis. Now, let's talk about Guzman Lopez for a second. This guy's no small-time player. He's part of the next generation of cartel leadership, the so-called Los Chapitos, who've been making waves in the narco world.
Judy, they are known as Los Chapitos, the four most trusted sons of the world's most notorious drug kingpin. As the I-Team has reported for several years, federal drug investigators here in Chicago consider El Chapo's sons in charge of the Sinaloa cartel that remains this area's largest trafficker of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines.
But here's the kicker. On that fateful day of July 25th, Joaquin Guzman Lopez ended up in cuffs right alongside El Mayo. That's right, the guy who allegedly set up this whole operation got arrested too. But why would Guzman Lopez set himself up like that? Well, that's where things get really interesting. Some people are speculating that he's hoping for a sweetheart deal from the U.S. government.
If the goal of Guzman and his henchmen was to eliminate El Mayo, then you think they could simply have killed him. The fact that they went through the effort of bringing him here to be prosecuted would suggest that Guzman has arranged for or is hoping for some sort of lenient treatment by the U.S. authorities.
It's a theory that makes a certain kind of sense. After all, if you're going to take down one of the biggest fish in the cartel world, why not try to get something out of it for yourself? But here's where we need to put on our detective hats and start asking some hard questions. If Guzman Lopez was working with the U.S. authorities, why did he end up arrested? Was this part of the plan all along, a way to maintain his cover, or did something go wrong?
You know, we've heard a lot of rumors swirling right now that and seem to be scrambling for information about what happened, just like everyone else.
And what about the Mexican government's role in all this? El Mayo claims he was led to believe he was meeting with the governor of Sinaloa. Was this just a story he cooked up, or was there some truth to it? Could there be high-level Mexican officials involved in this plot? It's a tangled web, and we're only just starting to unravel it. But one thing's for sure, the more we dig into this story, the more questions we uncover. Now, let's take a step back and consider the bigger picture for a moment. The arrest of El Mayo Zambada isn't just about one man, it's about the fall of an empire. The Sinaloa cartel, under El Mayo's leadership, was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. We're talking about a group that at its peak was believed to be responsible for smuggling 25% of all illegal drugs entering the U.S. from Mexico. That's a lot of money coming in.
El Mayo Zambada is worth close to $10 billion. And I'll remind you, that's a lot of money. There's 1,000 million and 1 billion.
So when a man like this falls, it sends shockwaves through the entire criminal underworld. It's like if Apple suddenly lost its CEO and half its board of directors in one day. You'd expect some pretty major upheaval, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing now. In the wake of El Mayo's arrest, there are reports of increased violence and tension in cartel-controlled areas. It's like a game of narco musical chairs, with everyone scrambling to grab territory and power before the music stops.
Rivals start to move in and it gets extremely bloody.
That's how one former FBI agent describes the situation, and it's a chilling prediction of what the future might have in store. We're not just talking about a temporary spike in violence. We could be looking at a full-blown cartel war that could turn the streets of Mexico into a real battleground. But here's where it gets really scary. This violence isn't likely to stay contained within Mexico's borders. As the cartels fight for control of drug routes and territory, we could actually see spillover into the United States. Remember, these organizations already have extensive networks in American cities. A full-blown cartel war could turn those cities into battlegrounds.
You will see people hanging from overpasses, beheadings.
It's a pretty horrific picture, isn't it? And it's all stemming from this one arrest. It really drives home just how big a player El Mayo was in the narco world. But let's circle back to the circumstances of his arrest, because the more we look at it, the more questions we have. If El Mayo really was kidnapped, as he claims, what does that say about the state of law enforcement in Mexico? Are we looking at a case of the ends justify the means, where authorities were willing to break the law to catch a bigger criminal? And what about the US government's role in all this? If they knew El Mayo was brought to the country against his will, does that make them complicit in an international kidnapping? It's a legal and ethical minefield that could have serious repercussions for US-Mexico relations. Speaking of which, let's talk about how this whole affair is playing out on the diplomatic stage. The Mexican government, unsurprisingly, isn't too happy about one of their citizens being snatched up and whisked across the border.
It appears that Mexican authorities had no role in any of this operation. They have said so publicly.
After all, not being able to capture one of your most prolific criminals for the better part of 5 whole decades isn't a good look for any government.
You know, the U.S. has worked hand in hand over the years with Mexico, but that relationship has become more difficult over the years.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Some experts are suggesting that elements within the Mexican government might have been in on the plan all along. After all, El Mayo claims he was led to believe he was meeting with a governor. So, if that's true, it suggests certain degree of high-level cooperation that goes way beyond your typical law enforcement operation. So, where does this leave us? Well, we're left with more questions than answers, that's for sure. Was El Mayo really kidnapped? Or is this just the last desperate claim of a man facing life in prison? If he was kidnapped, who was really behind it? The US government, Mexican officials, or rival cartels? And what about Guzman Lopez? What was his role in all this? And why did he end up arrested alongside El Mayo? Is he a criminal mastermind, a government informant, or just a pawn in a game much bigger than himself? As we dig deeper into this story, we'll explore these questions and more. We'll look at the potential fallout from El Mayo's arrest, both in terms of cartel violence and international relations. We'll examine the changing landscape of the drug trade and what it might mean for communities on both sides of the border. But most importantly, we'll try to unravel the truth behind one of the most intriguing arrests in cartel history. Because make no mistake, the story of El Mayo's capture is far from over. In fact, we're probably just getting started. Now that we've set the stage with El Mayo's dramatic arrest and the swirling allegations surrounding it, let's dive deeper into the potential consequences of this seismic event in the narco world. Because the ripple effects of El Mayo's fall are likely to be felt far beyond the borders of Mexico. First up, let's talk about the power vacuum left in the wake of El Mayo's arrest. Nature abhors a vacuum, and in the world of drug cartels, that vacuum tends to get filled pretty quickly and violently.
What I'm hearing so far from the state of Sinaloa is a lot of concern and fear that this is going to result in violence there.
That's the word from sources on the ground, and it's not hard to see why they're worried. The Sinaloa cartel isn't just going to roll over and call it quits now that El Mayo's gone. There are plenty of ambitious underlings ready to step up and claim the throne. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo? These guys have been itching to take full control of the cartel for years. With El Mayo out of the picture, they might finally have their chance.
And the Chapitos, like their father, they like the glory, they like being glorified in narco corridos, and the spotlight is on them.
That's a stark contrast to El Mayo's low-key approach, isn't it? And it could signal a major shift in how the Sinaloa cartel operates. We might be looking at a new era of flashy narco bosses who are more than happy to flaunt their wealth and power. But here's the thing, not everyone in the cartel is thrilled about the idea of Los Chapitos taking over. El Mayo was old school. He believed in keeping a low profile and minimizing violence to avoid heat from the authorities. The Chapitos, well, let's just say they have a different approach.
They fed their enemies alive to tigers, electrocuted them, waterboarded them, and shot them at close range with a .50 caliber machine gun.
That's right. These guys make their dad look like a choir boy in comparison, and their rise to power could trigger a wave of violence that makes previous cartel wars look like playground scuffles. But Los Chapitos aren't the only players in this game. There's also the possibility that someone from El Mayo's inner circle could step up. Remember, This is a man who built an empire on connections and loyalty. It's entirely possible that he's been grooming a successor that we don't even know about yet. And let's not forget about rival cartels. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, has been nipping at Sinaloa's heels for years. They might see El Mayo's arrest as their chance to make a big move.
You also have a very, very powerful and very violent drug organization by the name of Jalisco New Generation Cartel.
If the CJNG decides to make a play for Sinaloa territory, we could be looking at a cartel war of unprecedented scale. And guess who gets caught in the crossfire? Innocent civilians, that's who. What's even more concerning is that the fallout from this power struggle might end up being felt far beyond the borders of Mexico. Let's start with the obvious, the drugs. Under El Mayo's leadership, the Sinaloa cartel was one of the biggest suppliers of fentanyl to the United States. And with the cartel leadership now blown into bits, that crisis could get even worse.
Hospitals are forced to provide billions of dollars of uncompensated care. Fatal drugs like fentanyl are now flooding our streets.
In times of instability, cartels often ramp up production and trafficking to secure their position. We could see a flood of drugs hitting American streets as different factions try to assert their dominance. And in the chaos, quality control, as much as it exists in illegal drugs, could go out the window, leading to even more potent and dangerous substances. But it's not just about drugs. The instability in Mexico could lead to an increase in other criminal activities that directly impact the U.S. We're talking about human trafficking, weapons smuggling, and money laundering on a massive scale.
Now we have open borders, and despite the most recent executive action, the cartels, the open borders have enabled the cartels to become the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. They are making billions and billions, and the open border did nothing but enable them. And they have infiltrated into the United States even more so than they did before, and there's no way to put this toothpaste back in the tube.
This infiltration isn't just happening in border states. Cartel networks extend deep into the heartland of America. Cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and even New York could see an uptick in violence as different factions vie for control of distribution networks. And let's not forget about the potential for spillover violence as the cartels fight it out in Mexico. It's not hard to imagine some of that violence crossing the border. We could see assassinations, kidnappings, and other violent crimes increase in American cities with strong cartel presence. But perhaps the most insidious impact is one we can't easily see or measure: the corruption of American institutions. If the cartels are indeed as deeply embedded in the U.S. as some experts fear, we could see attempts to influence local politics, compromise law enforcement, and infiltrate legitimate businesses. It's a threat not just to public safety, but to the very foundations of our democracy. Now, let's circle back to El Mayo himself for a moment, because even as we're discussing the potential fallout from his arrest, there are still so many unanswered questions about how it all went down. One of the most intriguing aspects of this case is the alleged involvement of Joaquin Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's son. If he really did set up El Mayo, as some are claiming, what was his endgame? Was he hoping to take over the cartel himself? Or was he working with authorities in hopes of a reduced sentence?
How did the son of an imprisoned drug lord end up on a private plane in El Paso, Texas?
It's a question that's been puzzling investigators and cartel watchers alike, and the answer could shed light on a whole new level of intrigue within the narco world. But wait, there's another twist in this already convoluted tale. Guzman Lopez's lawyer is adamantly denying any deal with the authorities. In fact, he's painting a picture that's completely at odds with the idea of his client being some sort of mastermind or informant.
We've got no agreement with the government. There has never been an agreement with the government with Joaquin Guzman Lopez. There is no agreement, period. That's it.
That's a pretty unequivocal statement, isn't it? But it gets even more intriguing. The lawyer goes on to say,
I'm not sure exactly what actually happened.
Now, that's not exactly the kind of certainty you'd expect from someone defending a client accused of orchestrating such a high-profile arrest. And it sounds like Guzman Lopez's own legal team is as in the dark about what really went down as the rest of us. So where does this leave us? With even more questions. That's where, if Guzman Lopez wasn't working with the authorities, how did he end up on that plane with El Mayo? And if he wasn't the mastermind behind this operation, who was? But here's where it gets even more interesting. Some experts are speculating that this whole operation might have been part of a larger power play within the Mexican government itself.
But mark this. The Mexican government is complicit in these drug cartel organizations, no question about it.
That's a pretty explosive claim, isn't it? But when you consider the level of corruption that's been exposed in Mexican law enforcement and politics over the years, it's not entirely far-fetched. Could it be that certain factions within the Mexican government saw El Mayo as a liability and decided to get rid of him? Or was this a genuine attempt by honest officials to bring down one of the biggest players in the drug trade? The truth is, we may never know the full story. But one thing's for sure, the arrest of Mayo Zambada has opened up a Pandora's box of questions about the relationship between cartels, governments, and law enforcement on both sides of the border. So, where do we go from here? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The challenges ahead are daunting, to say the least. We're looking at the potential for increased violence in Mexico, a flood of drugs into the US, and the possibility of cartel influence spreading even further into American institutions. But it's not all doom and gloom. The arrest of El Mayo, as fraught with potential consequences as it is, also represents an opportunity. It's a chance to reassess our approach to the war on drugs, to strengthen international cooperation, and to address the root causes of the drug trade. One thing's for sure, the old strategies aren't working. The kingpin approach, where authorities focus on taking down cartel leaders, has been shown time and time again to have limited effectiveness.
I don't think that they will have any significant impact on the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel. And as an example, I will give to you exactly what happened when the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, Chapo Guzman, was extradited to the United States. Had no impact.
So, is it time to consider alternative approaches? Should the US be looking at decriminalization or even legalization as a way to take the profit out of the drug trade? It's a controversial idea, to be sure, but with the current strategies failing to make a dent in the problem, it's one that's gaining traction in some circles. And what about addressing the root causes of the drug trade? Poverty, lack of economic opportunities, and weak institutions all contribute to the power of the cartels. Maybe it's time for a Marshall Plan for Mexico and Central America, focusing on economic development and strengthening democratic institutions. Of course, none of these solutions are easy or quick fixes. They require long-term commitment, significant resources, and a level of international cooperation that's often been lacking in the past. But as we've seen with the arrest of Mayo Zambada, the current approach is like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. We're treating the symptoms without addressing the underlying disease. As we wrap up our deep dive into the arrest of Mayo Zambada and its potential consequences, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the human cost of this ongoing crisis. For every cartel leader arrested, there are thousands of lives ruined by addiction, violence, and poverty.
I don't want that to happen to anybody else. I'm devastated, I'm heartbroken, I'm shattered.
That's the voice of a parent who lost a child to fentanyl, and it's a reminder of the real stakes in this fight. It's not just about geopolitics or law enforcement statistics. It's about real people, real families whose lives are being torn apart by this endless cycle of violence and addiction. So, as we move forward from Mayo's arrest, let's keep that human cost in mind. Let's remember that behind every headline about cartel violence or drug busts, there are countless personal tragedies unfolding. The fall of Mayo Zambada marks the end of an era in the drug trade, but it also marks the beginning of a new chapter, one that's yet to be written. The choices made in the coming months and years will determine whether this chapter is one of continued violence and suffering, or whether it's the beginning of a new approach to a problem that has plagued our societies for far too long. As we sign off, we're left with a few questions that need answering. Given what you've learned about Mayo's arrest and its potential fallout, what do you think should be the top priority for law enforcement and policymakers moving forward? Is it cracking down harder on the cartels, focusing on corruption, or taking a completely new approach to the war on drugs? Feel free to share your thoughts down in the comment section below. And if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and to subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, stay safe